started. So I just want to welcome you to our next panel, which is on Romantasy, an emerging genre. And I'm going to give it over to the moderator, Amber Roberts, who's going to introduce everybody else. So here she is. Yeah.
Thank you. So today we have Laurie Forrest, a New York Times, USA Today, Publishers Weekly, and international best-selling author who lives deep in the backwoods of Vermont, where she sits in front of a wood stove drinking strong tea and dreaming up tales full of dryads, dragons, and wands. We also have Madison Rene, who has been a storyteller since she was a young child, her first original story being a tale called Quest Kids, written when she was 9, bearing nearly as many illustrations as there was text. Now her stories hold far more words than illustrations, but still exudes her love for the arts in her chapter-heading illustrations and maps. And on the end is Katherine Arden, the New York Times and Sunday Times best-selling author of books for adults and children, including the Winter Night Trilogy and the Small Spaces Quartet. She's been a finalist for Hugo and Locust Awards, as well as the Vermont Book Award. Her novel, Small Spaces, was on more than 25 state reading lists and won awards in 3 states, including the Vermont Golden Dome Award. And so I'm so excited to be here to chat with you all today about Romantasy. To get started, I'd love it if you could each just tell us a little bit about your books.
Guess I'm first?
Yeah.
So the Black Witch Chronicles, it kind of imagines, pretty much most fantasy novels have an evil lord, like Saruman or Voldemort or somebody like that. When I first started thinking about the book, and this is long, but I thought, what if the evil lord had grandchild? And what if all she knew of the world, and he won, the evil lord won, he didn't lose. And all she knew about the world was the world of the evil lord. And she didn't, all her history was from the evil group. And then what would happen if she then had to go to a university where she starts to meet people from all over this world? And she also might have some hidden powers too. So that's the idea of the Black Witch Chronicles, and I'm bad at summarizing it because it's a very big series, but that's the best I can do.
She Who Chose War actually was inspired by a dream that I had when my daughter was little. Something that I like to bring up a lot is like the diverse cultures in it. She comes from a primitive clan to emerge herself into an empire. It's an Industrial Revolution era. So she has to adopt to different customs, different traditions. But yeah, the main thing is really trying to find herself. It's a lot about self-identity, being told you're something, and then trying to emerge and find who your true self is. Those are kind of the themes I circle around. And of course, the wonderful romance that makes it Romantasy.
Hey guys, I actually don't write Romantasy, so I sneaked onto this panel. But I've written 4 books for adults and 4 for children. The books for adults are a trilogy set in medieval Russia, with based on partially on Russian history and partially on Slavic folklore and fairy tales. I've written also a standalone novel for adults called The Warm Hands of Ghosts, which is set during the First World War, about a pair of Canadian siblings. And I've written 4 books in a quartet for children. The first one's called Small Spaces, and it is I like to scare the youth. They're all 4. So yeah.
So in Romantasy, a big part of the genre kind of relies on world building sometimes. I would love to know what fantasy world, from books, movies, shows, games, whatever, you would most like to visit.
This one comes really easy to me. Does anyone know of Avatar: The Last Airbender? Yes, I'm a huge fan. In my book, I derive a lot of inspiration from it, but like I would totally love to live in that world.
Which kingdom?
I really love the Southern Water Tribes, but then again, the Fire Nation is really cool.
Oh gosh. If I could live in one of those places.
Or just visit.
Well,
I
brought a few books that I like in Romantasy, and Radiance. I think it's called Radiance. Yeah, it's one of my. I should remember the title, but it's. It's got a nocturnal world. It's by Grace Draven. And just the nocturnal world, the world building around it sounds so magical. I think I'd like to go there and experience that.
I mean, it's not an original answer, but probably Middle Earth. It is very large and very beautiful, and has a long stretch of history to choose from as well. So it'd be interesting to try different times and places in Middle Earth.
Romantasy has been popping up on bookstore shelves and across social media for a little while now. And I'm wondering what the label Romantasy means to you and what you think sets it apart from what's already been published kind of in the fantasy realm.
I mean, it's a marketing term. Like, I think what happened, there's been romantic novels set in fantasy worlds for decades, for much longer than there's been like the word romantasy. But what happened is, I think probably ACOTAR really like codified the genre, and the publishing industry discovered that it is a lucrative and popular genre that people love. And so it kind of gained its own space in the market. But it's very much like a term that helps with marketing, right? You want to know if the book has more romance or more fantasy, and a romantasy is essentially a book that centers the romance, whereas like a fantasy with a romantic subplot doesn't center it in the same way.
I remember reading Lord of the Rings, and I loved it when I read it in college. My partner got me to read it. But I did kind of wish there was some, I don't know, just some romance in there. So I think of kind of Lord of the Rings with the romance that I wanted in it. It was romantasy.
I mean, I'd take more women in Lord of the Rings.
A few women would be, a few more women.
Get the romance. A couple more females would be great. But yeah.
I agree with you. I will just say this, based on what you said, that scene where all the women are cowering, and he gives the sword to the 12-year-old boy. What mother would not be out there with the swords, like, to defend her children? I love Lord of the Rings, but that's just the weirdest scene. This never happened in history ever, where the women just cowered in the background. And
I mean, I feel like if you think of it as like a product of like the early 20th century, where you had very young boys getting drafted or enlisting into world wars, you have the sense of like the young being pulled against their will from their families to like fight.
Sure.
I think it's important. Like Tolkien was writing in the context of a world at war.
I've also noticed that romantasy sort of reads different too than like say Lord of the Rings, which is much more world building heavy. And not that romantasy isn't world building heavy, but I feel like it really focuses a lot on the characters. That's just from what I've seen from the different romances I've read and what I've seen from the genre.
yeah, I agree with you. I think it's more character driven.
Yeah.
I agree with that. Yeah.
I feel like it's an offshoot of the popularity of YA novels in like the early aughts. I think like there's this hunger amongst adult readers for fast-paced, emotionally driven, romantic, fantastical storyline, Twilight, right? And I think people realized that, we could do stories like that, but more mature, right? More explicit. And that kind of became this like, I think it evolved into romantasy. You could write a paper on this probably, like the evolution of like marketing terminology for book sales, yeah.
So that kind of leads me into my next question, actually, which was, are you more of a character first or a world first writer? And does that hold true in the books that you choose to read?
I am definitely a character-driven writer for sure. I tend to come up with ideas for the characters before I start building the world. And in general, I love it when I can really relate to the main characters and stories, and I love seeing their character arcs develop. I love the fantasy worlds, but it's not quite as vital to me, I'd say.
I mean, I feel like in novel writing, for me at least, plot kind of comes first. And I think world building and characterization are only interesting when they further or relate to or embellish the story you're reading. Like, I don't know, world building without story is a dictionary or an encyclopedia, right? And so for me, like, story comes first, and characterization and world building are offshoots of the story itself. But I know there's plenty of writers who build their world first and then play in that sandbox and build their story second. But I think it's very much a chicken or egg question. But for me, there's got to be a story, and then the rest of it can grow.
Yeah, I definitely developed, it was characters and plot, but as far as all the different cultures in my world and the politics, it was a bit of a mess. My editor made me go separately and write down all the different peoples and their different cultures to just streamline everything, but that had to come afterwards because I was so keyed into plot and characters.
How do you keep track of all of these world-building details as you write?
The little mini book that they made me write.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I go to my favorite bookstore, I get like a really special, beautiful, illustrated cover journal, and I just make notes, and I just discovered the Laurie of tabs for my book, so that's really helpful to like make notes and find things.
There's a person at your publisher, copy editor, and they make what's called a style sheet, which, especially for a series, contains things like all the characters, all of your like particular like voice choices, like your kind of like your constructions, like how you're writing, essentially. Plus, like, they keep track of relevant plot details, and so I definitely find myself leaning on the copy editor to tell me like, oh, in the last book, like, this person did that, or this country was like this. You have changed it now, Katherine. Copy editors are this kind of rare breed that are just like, it can be the most exciting story in history, and they're like, the mood's been full for 2 weeks. Just like that kind of brain. And you're like, that is true. That is true. Okay, I'm gonna fix that. So I definitely like depend on that person to keep me like on the straight and narrow with like book to book work. So yeah, we love copy editors. We love them.
That's so true. I based my environment for one of the lands on Vermont, and my editor was like, Laurie, you've got foliage season 3 times throughout this book.
Yeah, stuff like that.
And I did have a sunset that went on for hours and hours and hours.
The sun is still setting.
Yeah.
Discuss.
Yeah, and I had a chapter that I started with 3 dragons, and one just disappeared.
Yes,
I don't even
stuff
know where.
like that too.
And the editor, just in that tone they use, was like, you forgot about a dragon.
Forgot the dragon. I had a fake ship's log that had like headings, and the headings were like Tuesday, like November 10th, like 1794. And the copy editor was like, November 10th of that year was a Thursday. I'm so sorry. So like, it's an amazing kind of brain, like truly like a precise, detail-oriented, focused kind of brain. So it is really helpful for writers to have that. So
They're so clinical, though. Like, it's very rare you get them out of their box. Like, you know you wrote something good if they're like, oh, phew, thank God you killed him, or whatever, you know.
I have never gotten a compliment
Twice
from a
in the
copy
old
editor.
books.
Never in my life. Never in my life.
It's like getting some major award.
I literally never in my writing career has a copy editor been like, good job, or like, I enjoyed this. It's just like, mood's been full too long. Is she ever pee? It was actually a Thursday. Like, were tin cans invented by then? I don't think so. All you get. It's humbling. It's very humbling.
It's so humbling.
Yeah.
So do you tend to work a lot of real world setting or concepts like dates and time into your books? I know, Katherine, yours, kind of live in this world already, but for Romantasy, how do you balance the real world with the fantasy world and mesh them together?
That is a really great question, and I think it probably depends a lot from world to world too, and how much they derive. I know for me, my world is a very fantasy setting. I try to derive some inspiration, like some of the Latin terms and like some of the holidays, like getting other cultural influence. But in terms of like days and times, they are different for sure.
My world is like split between, well, the main worlds are a world that's got, it's basically Vermont with the 5 million foliage seasons that we got rid of. And then the other world's kind of like, I'm realizing right at this moment, it's kind of like Vermont on steroids. It's got like it's got a foliage season that doesn't just have the usual colors, it's like all the colors. So like violets and, I don't know why I didn't realize this was just Vermont on steroids. And there's a moon that once a year turns purple and the whole land's bathed in purple, and they have a giant festival that's all based on purple, and there's a purple dragon goddess. And so yeah, that's obviously fantasy, but first few books, Vermont. And I even took place names in Vermont and threw them in there, so the Vermonters notice.
I feel like there's a useful distinction, at least sort of in fantasy publishing, which is there's first, second, and third world fantasy. And first is essentially fantasy that takes place in our world, recognizably. Second is like portal fantasy, like our world exists, but the action takes place in a different Narnia, different world. And third world is like, this is a new environment. This is not us, this is Middle Earth, right? And I feel like you can kind of categorize most fantasy novels into one of these three categories as far as world building goes. But even if your book takes place in a totally unrelated world, we do often pull from either history or the present or our own environment, I think, to build those worlds. So, and every world has to have at least its own internal logic. So like a predictable number of leaf seasons, right? Like it's gotta be, so I think the big sort of trick to world building is making the logic consistent within your own world. I mean, my books are set in history. I like historical fiction, so I do a lot of like research for my books, which helps with world building because you can go back on facts for your stuff. But I'm always interested in how others approach different kinds of world building.
I'm a little fascinated by this. I'm just going to ask a side question. How do you even go about starting the research for a historical novel? It just feels so daunting to me. The internet's great. Databases of like articles, books. There's plenty of experts in niche subjects that love talking about it. Oh God, will discourse at you for hours. I think it's just like any other kind of sort of paper-based thing. I do like grounding fantastical elements in a recognizable sort of place and time. It makes me happy personally. But did you read a lot of books kind of in that time period in preparation for writing?
Yeah, I often do. Yeah. I like nonfiction and history, so it kind of plays to my sort of personal interests for sure.
What is the coolest thing you've been able to research for any of your books that you've written?
Horses. I didn't realize how little I knew about horses until beta readers who owned horses. One in particular who has like a horse farm, and they all took me aside and were like, Laurie, you've never been near a horse, have you? These are not cars. They can't go forever, like at really fast speeds for like a full day. You have to feed them, you have to slow it down, you have to rest the horse. So, and then I got an editor who has horses, so she saved me. I've learned a lot about horses.
Do you want one now that you've learned about them?
No, they sound very labor intensive. I asked them, could it be a fantasy? Like it's a fantasy world. Could it be a fantasy horse that can? She's like, no, Laurie, no. Ground it in something
Good
real.
to ground things, yeah.
I will say I didn't know enough about the Industrial Revolution before I started writing, like the technological advancements and sort of like the way of life at that time. That is something that I researched a lot. as well as mining, because mining has a really important part of my book. So that's been something interesting that I've researched and learned about.
My most recent novel is set in the last year of World War I, and so I did a very deep dive into that conflict, which has tons and tons and tons of written material about it, especially primary sources. A lot of folks who were in the war left behind letters or memoirs or other sort of firsthand accounts, and I dove in really far. And I also spent 3 months on the Western Front touring battlefields. And if you ever want like a sort of off the beaten path, like trip to France, World War I battle sites are fascinating. There are tons of them. People lived there for 4 years. You can still find like barbed wire, bullet casings, bottles in the woods. Like there's still stuff just lying around. And there's places where it's like the ground looks like the moon. It's been so cratered and nobody ever fixed it. They just left it alone afterwards. So it feels very present, which is very cool. There's signs that say like danger, unexploded ordnance, and it's literally shells that were fired 100 years ago and are still unexploded in the ground. It's really fascinating.
So I love that Romantasy combines my two favorite genres, which are romance and fantasy. I started out as a fantasy reader and kind of moved my way into the romance category. I would love to know what genre made you a reader and what genre made you want to start writing.
The gateway. I had never read anything really but like classics and nonfiction. And then my kids were all my daughters were preteen, like around preteen age, and they kept trying to get me to read Harry Potter. Please read Harry Potter. And I was like, no, I'm glad you like it, but I'm not into that. And then I finally sat down and started reading it, and I just couldn't stop reading. Luckily, I got into it, and the book they had all come out. They had just all come out. So I read through that entire series. I kid you not, in about like 4 months. And I started reading everything they handed me, and then I started reading adult fantasy. So yeah, my kids' fantasy novels.
Fantasy is definitely what got me into reading too. I'm trying to think what my first one was. Like I loved The Wizard of Oz, like some of the classics, Chronicles of Narnia. Harry Potter definitely made me a very solid reader. Fablehaven is another one. And I would say, I'm trying to think what made me be a writer. Probably fantasy as well, but I remember the Babysitter's Club books. And I remember being young, kind of modeling my stories after those. So, yeah, definitely fantasy and probably just whatever stories I really loved as a kid.
I would say my first love was horror, actually. I really liked spooky stories as a kid. I liked Goosebumps. I was really into like John Valaire's and Mary Downing Hahn. I liked like collections of scary folk tales and like real life ghost stories. I loved a lot of fantasy too, and also some historical fiction. I remember reading like The Witch of Blackbird Pond at a formative age. Johnny Tremaine, these sort of well-known kids historical fiction works, and I loved them. So I think it was all three together that got me to be a reader.
And marketing books via tropes is pretty popular on social media. You can give a quick snapshot of kind of what people might find and what they can expect in the book. I'm curious which romantasy, fantasy, or romance tropes are your favorites, and do you write the same tropes that you love to read?
Yes. So I really enjoy the forced proximities. Who doesn't enjoy that? I also really like enemies to lovers. found family is one that's really growing on me. Because while I do love the romantic love, there's something about platonic love that just really has been really inspiring to me. I write what I love, really. I'm very passionate about the topics that I write about. So I do think I do really enjoy the same tropes.
I'm going to be completely honest and say the tropification of fiction is enraging and abhorrent to me. I deeply dislike the notion that like a book can be summarized by a list of like a little listicle of like the tropes that are in it. I think it encourages unoriginal thinking, and I think that it also encourages books that are just a hollow collection of like your favorite tropes without any reach for quality craft, originality, or what to me makes fiction worth reading. And I realize it's good for social media, it's good for TikTok. I realize that it does help readers congregate towards books that work for them, but I think it's also very reductive, and there's many fantastic books that cannot be reduced to a list of its tropes. So I do dislike it as a way of categorizing and describing novels. Here. Thanks.
I came into it via the fantasy angle first. It's not so much, I was reading all these books my kids gave me, then I went to adult fantasy, and there was some romance, but it was mainly fantasy. And when I wrote the 2 books, and then I segued backwards and started reading all this romantic fantasy that my kids were now into, and then also readers were into eventually. And then I realized that I had put all the tropes pretty much in my books, so it just kind of happened organically. And I do know that there's definitely the love triangle, and people have strong opinions about that. And then I even have a love quadrangle in this book that's coming, so if they don't like quadrangles, maybe they won't like it.
That sounds awesome.
The quadrangle, it is, just worked out that way.
So there are a lot of different storytelling methods, like Save the Cat or the hero's journey, the 3-act structure. Do you keep any of those in mind while you are writing or outlining, or do you kind of forge your own path in your storytelling structure?
Well, what are the 2 types? The pantser and the...
Pantser and plotter?
Planner.
Yeah, I'm definitely a pantser. Just, 5 million, I kept finding new side characters, and I just kept writing, and the plot kept expanding. And then my editor was like, on the last book, she's like, Laurie, you do know that you need closure at this point. This is the last book. So she gave me the Save the Cat, because she forced me. She's like, you have to write an outline. You have to plot this one. You can't write like this for this one. And it was so hard for me, but it was so good that she had me do that, because that last book in a series, I can understand now, like if you read a series that sometimes you say, oh, that last book, it still kept going. It's really hard to just make a decision.
When does it end?
Yeah, and not invent new characters. She's like, you're done inventing people.
Yeah. I feel like too, like I am a planner. I tried doing that, like that 3-arc, but I feel like as I go along, I start developing more ideas and more characters and more like subplots. So I feel like I can have all the plans in the world, but it always goes beyond what I initially planned it to do. So,
in case people don't know what Save the Cat is, it's something and you guys might know more about it, but I read the book that she gave me. It's a formula, I think a person that teaches screenwriters in Hollywood. Yeah. And it basically, he broke down the most popular films based on story beats, where the characters have a little relaxation, where the tension ramps back up again, where you think you have a full sense of security, and then the tension ramps up, and then it ramps up again, and then you end, so it's just this. It's fascinating, actually, because if you read these books, he breaks the films that we've all seen or books we've all read down into these plot points, and it actually works.
If you read it and then watch any action movie ever made, it will completely ruin the ending for the movie for you, because you will have figured it out based on these plot points.
Then
I can't
maybe
enjoy
don't read
media
it.
anymore because of this book.
Maybe you shouldn't read it. Don't do that. Don't read it.
So you are a pantser.
Oh, yeah.
I'm a hybrid.
You're a hybrid.
Much superior.
I usually start freehanded with just writing, and then I'll do like a sketch outline about halfway through, just so I can like codify what I'm thinking and how I think the ending might go. I definitely don't follow like a structure. One thing I think is nice about the novel as an art form is that it lends itself to like sort of free form work, like books like I don't know, like War and Peace or Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, a more recent example, is these long, sprawling, sort of open books that don't really have like a tight structure, but they work. But also books that do have very tight structures can also work. So it's an art form that's very flexible, which I really appreciate. And different kinds of books can work creatively and sort of commercially, depending on the content, not just like how they're structured, which is nice.
Well, kind of like with what you said before about not pinning this down like to inhibit creativity, really, the tropes. I think it's the same thing almost with, I'm saying all this stuff, but then you watch something like The Witcher, which has this crazy back and forth structure that I've never seen before. And thank goodness the author didn't follow some set thing, because it's kind of brilliant.
I mean, in a way, I do feel like The Witcher is not, I'm so honest. The Witcher I don't think is good, well written. I think the books aren't very good. I think that the video game and later the TV show took what was best in his creativity, his world, his characterization, and drew that out and kind of like helped refine some of the structural problems with the writing. And one great thing I think about stories moving to different mediums is they can be refined and changed, often improved, as they move through. So, man.
So do you ever end up with writer's block? And if so, how do you kind of shake it off and move through it?
Well, I think we all probably go through writer's block, I'm guessing. I definitely have hit a roadblock, usually around the middle of the book. Well, I write very long books. They're like, 100,000 words, like 400 pages roughly. So what I usually do is I just try to force through it. I just try to, inspiring music really helps me get through the writer's block. Sometimes if I read something in the genre can help, but really it's just a matter of keep going, because if I can get past the part that I'm stuck on, it's usually pretty smooth sailing after that. But because I used to give up when the writer's block would hit, and then I would just move on to a different project and never come back to it.
I feel like I get asked this a lot. I do a lot of school visits, and like the kids always ask, like, what if you're stuck? I mean, the answer I usually give is that you don't lose your ability to make sentences. You can always keep writing words. What's got you paralyzed is the fear that the words will be bad. Mm-hmm. That's the fear. The fear is that you'll write something else and it won't be good enough to finish your book with, or to be good enough with. And the answer, I think, for me is to just remind yourself that drafts, like the words good and bad, don't help when applied to drafts. Like the only job of a first draft is to exist on the page. And it can be fixed, but you can't fix a draft that's not there. And so it's so important to keep from getting blocked, to not think, oh, this is good, or oh, this is bad. Just keep making sentences. So.
I think that's really true. I know my last book in my series, I work in healthcare, and COVID was going on, and it was just, I was like, oh my God, I know how it ends, but I don't know how, and I was on contract, and it had to be written within a year, and I was panicking. And then somebody in my writer group was like, you got this, just do what you do, write every day, and aim to write it bad. aim to write it bad. Just write a really bad book. And something about that just, I don't know. I just, all of a sudden I start writing again. And it was just, I actually wrote it down and put it by the computer. And it was fun again after that, like once I got back into it.
I love that. Write a really bad book.
Aim to, though. Like, and it's kind of like NaNoWriMo. That's why I think it's so inspirational for so many authors. It's the writing month, National Novel Writing Month, where people aim to just write a certain number of pages, but you do not focus on quality. And I think it's kind of similar, but it's almost more inspirational to just say write it bad, because aim to. Because you're going to write something that is going to have a combo of amazing things and things you're going to edit out, but you are going to come up with amazing things, if any of you are writers.
So that makes me curious how much your writing changes, whether that's plot or character or anything, how much it changes from your first draft to your final draft.
Mine changed a lot. My first book sold. The condition of that sale from my editor at the time was that I would take the novel I'd sold, cut it in half, discard the second half, and rewrite the first half. And I was like, okay. And so the book that became my debut, my first novel, was the original first half of the sold manuscript. So I feel like almost all my books have changed heavily in draft. I have friends who write flawless first drafts too. So it's quite variable, I think, author to author.
I don't have a writing background. I'm a dentist, so I have a very heavy math and science background. I'd never taken a writing class, but I love to read. I mean, I was always an avid reader. So my first drafts, like, you know, they even told me, like, this is a really great story, but this is just terribly written. You're going to have to really, and I had to rewrite it about, I mean, I think I got the equivalent of an MFA the hard way, because I had to write over 20 versions of that first book to learn the things that you learn if you study writing, which is fascinating and amazing, because I read differently than I've ever read before, and I actually get so much more enjoyment out of reading books. But oh my God, yeah, the quality. It's painful to look at. Yeah, I had a lot to learn.
It's really hard to look back at original work and see how far you've come and like, wow. I would definitely say, well, I'm only publishing my second book in December of this year, so I don't have a lot out cataloged, but from the books that I have written that are unpublished and the book I have published, I'd say probably about 30% gets either taken out or greatly changed. Yeah. Like this last book that's coming out in December, at the last minute, as I was trying to do the final copy edit with my editor, I was like, you know what, I don't really like how the second half of this book reads. I'm gonna just like change major plot points the last, what are you doing? So it really depends on the story too, you know. Yeah.
I feel like the misconception among readers is that editing involves like hunting for commas or typos, whereas like actual editing is major book surgery, and it often really sucks to have to do, but it's things like I gotta combine two characters, or take out a massive chunk, or redo a massive chunk, or change the ending, or change the opening scene. Like it really can be major book surgery, and often a book that's gone through good editorial looks very different from the book that it started as. So it's heavy, intensive work. It's not just like hunting for typos.
Yeah, I never forget when I got my first professional from HarperCollins. Like, these are editors, these are high up there editors. Like, you get your first edit back. And I remember I burst into tears. I burst into tears, and my husband was like, "Look, this is a major editor at HarperCollins. You can save your first draft. You don't have to throw it out. Why don't you just try and write a draft with everything that this woman says, and just see what happens?" I was like, okay, but
Do y'all get the compliment sandwich too? It's a thing.
Yep.
So editors come back with their notes in an edit letter, and at least the way mine does it is she starts with like, "Dear Katherine, I loved the way you use I don't know, this beautiful word choice here," so a compliment. And then there's like 20 pages of the most like savage critique.
Yeah.
Like just page after page of heartbreaking, specific, brutal criticism. And at the end she's like, but oh, the wonderful use of metaphor here and here. Thank you, have a nice day. So it's a sandwich, right? It's a compliment sandwich.
It's always that last, don't throw yourself off a bridge sentence.
Yes, like it's fine though. But
You're
like,
a lovely person.
Truly, it's like 20 pages of why your book child is subpar.
Yeah.
And it does hurt somewhat to
Well,
read.
let me just say this though. So I wrote it, I followed everything and I just got into it. And then I stopped and reread the whole book. It was 500 million times better. And that was that. I mean, after that, it was like, okay, I'll take this brutal, soul-destroying
Oh, they're always right. Like the thing is, they're never wrong.
They're never
about
wrong.
The things. I find that people who read your book who are good readers can almost always pinpoint what's wrong, but if they try and say how to fix it, they're always incorrect. I think readers can identify the problems, but can rarely offer good solutions. I think editors too. My editor's that way too. She can always find the problem.
So what advice do you have for somebody who may be considering writing their first romantasy or first novel in any genre, or maybe has been trying to write a book and is just kind of looking for a little push to keep going?
Do it. It's real. I mean, it's challenging and we're making it sound horrific. It's really amazing and it's a lot of fun and it's magic. And one of the cool things I like about writing, but also what I like about reading, is you can kind of like incorporate everything you love. If you like, I don't know, diamond pane glass on windows, your world can have that. And I really enjoy that reading other people's fantasy because you can tell what they love, you know. But it's just, you meet amazing people, you learn a lot about yourself. Yeah, it's great.
I think too, like reading widely is something that really helped me a lot, especially in the romantasy genre, like picking up on those trends, picking up on the writing styles, different structures, can be really helpful. Learning the tropes. I know, Catherine, you mentioned you didn't like tropes. Right? No, it was totally
salty.
So I didn't really know about tropes until I entered the romantasy genre. And they're like, well, what tropes does it have? And I'm like, oh, I don't know. I need to like think about this. So I think like gathering that in advance would have definitely helped me more to be prepared and to think about those key points as I'm writing it too. Would have been helpful.
I do think I'm going to put the quadrangle, the love quadrangle trope on the map, though.
Please do.
Do it.
I actually do.
Yes.
So,
I would say advice. I would say finish what you start. It is much easier to begin a novel or story than it is to finish one. Beginning, you're all enthusiastic, you have your ideas, you have your fresh paper or your new Word document, you're stoked. There comes a time in every book that I call the sad middle. And it's when you're far from the end, but also far from the beginning. And you're getting kind of bored, kind of frustrated. You have a new shiny idea like lurking on the horizon. And you just have to push through it. And you learn so much more by finishing a piece than you do by starting one. It's like juggling. Like almost anybody can like take 6 oranges and throw them in the air. I can, but the trick is catching all 6. That is hard. And so you gotta practice your juggling to be able to catch all 6 oranges. You gotta practice your writing to finish your pieces. And honestly, the ending is more important, right? Because it's what you leave your reader with. And so learning to write endings, learning to finish what you start is so important. And so many people like begin their novel and get stalled 30 pages in, or 50 pages in, or 3 chapters in. Like you just have to keep going.
I'm stuck in that middle part right now of my current book, so that is
Sad
perfect
middle.
advice for me.
Yeah. It's a thing.
So before we open it up to questions, I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about what's next for each of you and where we can find you online, on social media, anywhere that we can follow you.
Me? I just talked. I just discoursed loudly at everyone for the last 3 minutes.
all right, let's see. What am I working on? It's weird. I've been on a deadline for like since 2016.
Wow.
Since 2016. Yeah. So and I'm so happy to be off deadline, but deadline gets you to do things and finish them.
Does?
I work full time, so it's really good to be off deadline, but I don't know, I'm trying to figure out how to self-impose a deadline without the deadline. I have a standalone Romantasy that I wrote when I was waiting to see if someone would pick up The Black Witch. It's something I wrote, oh man, 15 years ago. So it's kind of fun to revisit that kind of, different time in your life. But I've got that, and then, a bunch of different projects. One is based on a classic. I don't think a lot of people know about Lorna Doone, but it was one of my favorite classics that I've ever read. It was like my favorite book in junior high, and I thought it'd be really fun to do Lorna Doone and Dragons, like throw fantasy in there. So I've got that going too.
So I have a prequel novella coming out on Thanksgiving, actually, and then I have the completion to my Romantasy duology coming out December 21st of this year. So it was really a matter of trying to get all that wrapped up and get the proofreads done. Beyond that, I think I'm going to keep going on the Romantasy vein. There's one in particular that, again, it's diverse cultures because that's just something that really interests me. I was thinking like a desert prince and more of a European princess are forced into an arranged marriage with some magic things involved and all that good stuff. But yeah, I have a lot of ideas in the back burner. I'm mostly on Instagram. I'm not really like a huge lover of social media. And I'm just starting to dabble into TikTok. That's a learning curve.
I've had a productive year, which I'm happy for because my last years weren't that much. So I just finished a novel draft, and I did 2 short stories and an introduction to a different novel, with a new kids book coming for the rest of the year, and all those things are coming out in 26.
Nice.
So one thing about publishing is that you have a long lead time between things that are finished and things that are published. So my new book for adults is set in Brittany, France during the early Renaissance. And it combines history with Breton folklore and mythology.
Does anybody want to kick us off with some Q&A? Yeah.
Oh, just off of that, Brittany, France, what era was that, did you say?
So 1491 is the year of the book. So it's like early Renaissance, early to mid. So
The only reason I asked is because Portrait of a Lady on Fire, have you seen that movie?
I have not actually.
It's not 1400, 1700s, but
yeah.
I also think that it's set in Brittany. That's the word association, that's all.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting region, definitely. Yeah.
So, with combining romance and fantasy, whereas very famous fantasy novels are usually from a male third-person perspective, and romance kind of lends itself to a female first-person perspective. What POV do you guys write from, and who is usually your central character?
So I actually write multi-point of view with my books, a male and female perspective. I definitely think in the romantasy genre, there's a lot more female voices. And like you said, predominantly first person. I'm most comfortable writing in third person. But I did just recently discover an author who does write even spicy romantasy as a male author. So it I guess it does happen, but it's super rare.
I started my series in female protagonist first person, but then it just got so big, and I was kind of feeling that middle book boredom. And the thing that solved it was going into multiple points of views. They were still first person, but then everything got fresh, to just go into some multiple points of view.
So far, my books have been in third person omniscient, which means you can skip from people's heads and then step back and move away from their heads, which is a bit old fashioned, I think, but I do enjoy it. It gives you a lot of cameras, I guess, to like tell the story from, having a flexible narrative voice, which especially as a younger author is helpful to like give you more tools in your toolbox to tell your story. I think I really admire like first person perspective writers because you are keeping yourself to one voice, one set of eyes, like one headspace, which can make it more challenging to like get all of the pieces in place for your narrative. Yeah.
I would like to know what you consider your first success as a writer.
I mean, finishing a book is hard already. Just like getting a draft on paper.
Yeah,
It's a huge
finishing a book.
challenge. For sure.
Yeah. I was gonna say finishing that, that first draft. I feel like I wrote many stories before I finally got a completed first draft. Also, there's nothing like holding your book in your hands before publication. That part is like really amazing.
Yeah, it's a crazy experience to have I think most people that write love reading and just treasure it, and just to feel an actual book that you wrote is just, I don't know, it's almost like, I'm not worthy, how did this even happen?
I mean, the thing about being a writer though is the success bar is always retreating. Because like first, I finished my draft, yay. I need an agent, get the agent, yay. Publisher, like there's always a new goal or a new measure of success. Like, and once you're published, it's things like more sales, be a bestseller, get foreign rights deals, film deals. Like there's always something you can reach for or something you can desire as a writer. So I think it's very hard to be like wholly, like, I've made it. You're always looking for the next thing, which can be a positive and a minus, I think. Yeah.
Just wondering if you always start at the very beginning of your book, or maybe do you ever start like in the middle and then find your way to the beginning, or like how you like start your writing process?
I usually start in the beginning. I used to write it by scenes, but then trying to put it back together was like a waterlogged jigsaw puzzle, and nothing would like fit properly. I've just found a lot more success when I like start from the beginning and then just work chronologically, but that's just how my brain works too.
I go out of order pretty often. My first book for kids was written from the middle to the end and then the beginning to the middle. So I think it's just your mileage may vary as far as like your strategy goes.
I wasn't setting out to write a book. I didn't even know that I could. I was reading all the fantasy that first my kids had given me, and as I'm reading it, I started to get a story in my head that just kept coming up. And there's just this idea of a world where people with wings are just kind of viewed as evil, and like all the different cultures, like most of them in this one region and their religious books peg them as evil. And it's just this scene of this young man that had wings and had to keep them in hiding. And so I finally, at one point, I don't even know what got me doing it. One night, I had some free time, and I just sat down and I wrote the scene out. I'd never written anything other than nonfiction for like technical things or whatever. And reading it back was like, oh my goodness, it's like reading a book by somebody. And then I started just getting all these ideas, and I just kept writing and writing and writing and writing. And it was this crazy year where I wrote, like, I'd get ideas on the way to work. The story just took hold. It was so magical, and I just kept writing. And I had basically the first 2 books really messy at the end of the year. And I never in a million years thought about it actually becoming a book until my husband read it and was like, this is a really good story. This could actually, if it was edited, it could maybe someday get published. I was like, are you kidding me? I'm a math scientist. No way, I could never be an author. And he got me to join a writing group, and they all loved it too. And then somebody in the writing group was a best-selling author, and she hooked me up with an agent, and one thing led to another. But I guess my point is, if you love doing this, do it. You don't need any credentials or anything. Just write it badly, just do it.
Do you tend to edit from the beginning to the end, or do you jump around when you edit? I'm asking this purely for selfish reasons because I'm trying to find a new editing method that works for me.
It's interesting you mention that because I've actually heard the technique of starting backwards because that can help you catch things better. I have not done that myself. Usually what I do is I read through it without touching it first and like seeing more of the plot with it. How does it read? Typically I do it chronologically unless I'm doing like story changes where I'm like, okay, this scene really needs to be improved and then I need to go back and start like threading things back through. That helps.
I mean, I had someone tell me once that editing is making the butt match the face. Which, once you know for sure the ending, a lot of editing is making sure the rest of the book builds correctly to that ending. And so the first big step is getting that ending solid, and then you're building up to it for the rest of your editing process. So I do start from the beginning, go back through.
It was a crazy learning experience. My initial idea with the young man with the wings that, people hated people with wings, my idea was there's going to be two sets of people. This romance, eventually between this young woman raised in this basically evil society who's been taught that all these certain things are evil, like people with wings, and then you get this other character, and at some point their worlds are going to collide, along with a whole bunch of other people colliding. And I knew that middle part, I knew that end of the series, and I had that beginning chapter in my head right from the beginning, but it was the middle.
I think a lot of writers complain about the middle.
Yes.
Like know the beginning and know the end, but like getting there in an interesting way can often be very challenging.
It's kind of, it's like the storytelling books are laughing at us when they call it the fun and games section, because it's not fun and games for us when we're writing it. Yeah.
We've been talking about, I think you mentioned the continuity thing of the copy editor or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
For those of you who have written sequels, have any of you written sequels to books of previous? For those of you who have written those, how do you maintain the continuity and how do you maintain character development and everything across that? I'm currently working on a sequel to my own book and it's complicated and challenging, and I just wondered if you had any thoughts.
Something that I always planned for a 2-book series going into it, so I kind of knew what was going to be in the second book as I wrote the first. But in terms of consistency, is that what you mean?
Yeah, how do you, when you finish the first book, how do you go into the second one trying to maintain everything that's happened with character development, all the plot, while still having something else, somewhere else for the characters to grow, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely tricky. I think thinking about their end goal, where do I want them to be at the end of all of this, I think is really helpful to work towards reaching that goal, and what kind of interesting obstacles would come in their way. Or something I often think of is okay, after the end of the book, what is theoretical that would happen next? What is after they're happily ever after, essentially? Something I think about, I guess.
I mean, in a way, getting too sort of in the weeds about it might be too stressful and not help. If you just keep writing, keep telling the story, you can always go back and adjust how the characters grow and respond to the events that happen, so you can make their arc smoother. I feel like the first step is to get the story beats down, and you can always make adjustments to things like the pacing, their reactions, their emotional maturity as it grows can be tweaked in edits. So I wouldn't get too bogged down, I guess is my answer, and that kind of thing, because it will often work itself out in editorial.
My editor had to have me separate out because there's so many main characters, the separate story threads, and kind of, this was later on, as we're getting, as you're getting further into the story, because it does get more complicated, because my series has essentially 7 books in it. One of the books has 2 books together. So we had to separate out the characters and make sure we really follow them, but there were these, it was important to have these real world, like these moments that would throw the characters completely off kilter to keep the tension up. Or if it's a romance, like which characters still have unresolved romantic threads, you know, but it was like, there were events that threw everybody off kilter, so then it became interesting to go back to the different groups to find, or the different people, and find out how they're responding to this major moment. But I think that one thing I've learned is you do have to kind of throw those points of tension in where you just pull the rug out from under your characters, because then it stays like you want to know what happened next.
I think a cheat code could be keeping the chronology tight between books. Like if you have like, and then 10 years pass between books, you will start from a very different place versus like a book beginning that very same night, that very same hour, right? And so one way to keep tension is to kind of keep the storytelling on a pretty tight time horizon instead of having it stretch over long periods. Might help if you're feeling like the pacing's dropping off between books.
That's a really good point.
Very helpful. Thank you.
I think maybe one more question, if we have one more. Yeah?
Do you have recommendations for the romantasy genre? Yes.
I brought some. I figured somebody would ask that, and I have 500 million I could give you, but I just grabbed what I saw in front of me. So my readers give me so many great ideas. 5 million people told me to read this. It was so fun. It was so good. She's got the bag.
Rebecca Yarros.
Oh, this is the one with the nocturnal people. 5 million people told me to read this. This has got the people that live during the day and the people that their entire society lives at night. I won't say too much more, but this is beautifully written too. It's gorgeously written, like, you know, like an olden time book. I don't know, it's just really good. Oh, I'm so sorry. This is Grace Draven. And she self-published, but it just hit it big because the writing is so good. My kids got me to read this. They warned me. They're like, Mom, this one they're in high school. They're Mom, we want to warn you. There's an extremely sexy scene in this, so just don't be shocked.
What's the name of that one?
Uprooted. She's a phenomenal writer. She also did almost like a semi-historical series I think I haven't read yet. I think it's the Time of Napoleon, only you throw dragons into the mix, but she basically fused actual historical research with what if there were dragons, like in an army. And just a few more. Oh, I didn't get them all. Oh, Enchantment of Ravens, we were talking about that before.
Yes.
That's just a beautifully written book on the Fae. Really just beautiful in the details, light, kind of cozy fantasy like what's popular now. Just a book that's just a lot of fun. Enchantment of Ravens.
She wrote a magical library book called Sorcery of Thorns.
Fantastic.
Which was really good.
Amazing.
Which was really good. Yeah.
Rogerson?
Margaret Rogerson.
Yeah. Everything she does is really good. There's so many.
I love everything by Holly Black.
Oh,
She's
yes,
been a
so
huge
good.
inspiration to me.
So good.
I love her Folk of the Air series. It's just phenomenal.
Yeah.
I listened to that one on audio, and it was the best time.
I enjoyed Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies by Heather Fawcett.
So good.
It was a very charming sort of Victorian pastiche novel with fairies. Super delightful. This grumpy sort of researcher who focuses on like the fairy realm has this kind of like frenemy relationship with her colleague who's like a hidden fairy king. It's very good. It's very charming. There's 2 books out and the 3rd one's coming out next year.
I'm reading the 3rd book because I know her and we share an agent, and it's just as good as the rest of the series. Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. Definitely write it down. It's a send-up of academia. Mm-hmm. It's absolutely hysterical and just really charming and beautifully written.
All right, I think our time is up. So thank you very much for coming and listening to us.